The autumn wind of 1882 cut through the Wyoming plains like a blade, rattling the windows of the Mitchell farmhouse as Sarah pressed her ear against the thin wooden door. Her father's voice carried from the kitchen, thick with desperation and whiskey. "She's 23, Hiram. Been married before and nothing came of it. Doc says she's likely barren, but she's got strong hands and knows how to keep house." Thomas Mitchell's words hit Sarah like physical blows. "Your ranch needs a woman's touch, and we need the money to keep this place." Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped her worn shawl tighter. Through the crack in the door, she could see Hiram Blackwood's imposing figure seated at their rickety kitchen table, his expensive coat a stark contrast to the poverty surrounding him. The wealthy rancher's cold grey eyes showed no emotion as he considered the proposition. $500, Hiram said finally, his voice devoid of warmth. "That's generous for damaged goods." The phrase damaged goods echoed in Sarah's mind. 3 years of marriage to William Porter had ended with his death from pneumonia, leaving her childless and, according to the town gossips, cursed with barrenness. She'd returned to her family's struggling farm, hoping for comfort, only to find herself being sold like livestock. "She'll do as she's told," her father continued, the scrape of his chair against the floor suggesting he was leaning forward eagerly. "Sarah's always been obedient, never gave us trouble." Sarah backed away from the door, her heart pounding. She'd heard enough. Moving silently through the dark hallway, she climbed the creaking stairs to her small room under the eaves. The space was barely large enough for a narrow bed and a trunk containing her few possessions. Moonlight filtered through the single window, casting shadows across the faded quilt her grandmother had made. Sitting on the edge of her bed, Sarah fought back tears. She thought of her first marriage, how young and hopeful she'd been at 19, believing love would bloom with time. William had been kind but distant, and when months passed without a child, the disappointment in his eyes had grown heavier each day. The town women whispered that she was lacking, that some essential part of womanhood had been denied her. Now, 4 years later, she was being handed over to Hiram Blackwood, a man known for his harsh treatment of workers and his previous wife's mysterious death 2 years ago. The official cause had been a fall down the stairs, but the way people's voices dropped when they spoke of it suggested darker truths. The sound of chairs scraping and boots on floorboards told her the men were concluding their business. Sarah moved to her window and watched as Hiram mounted his horse, a satisfied expression on his weathered face. Her father stood in the doorway, counting bills in the lamplight. That night, Sarah lay awake planning her escape. She had $17 saved from selling eggs and vegetables at the market. Not much, but enough for a train ticket to somewhere far from here. Pine Ridge, a small mining town nestled in the mountains 300 miles north, had been advertising for workers in the territorial newspaper. It was remote enough that her past wouldn't follow her, and desperate enough that they might not ask too many questions about a woman traveling alone. As dawn broke grey and cold over the Wyoming plains, Sarah quietly packed her few belongings. She left behind the fancy dress her mother had altered for the wedding, taking only practical clothes, her grandmother's Bible, and a photograph of her parents from happier times. At the bottom of her trunk, she found the letter from her late husband's lawyer, confirming that William's death hadn't been her fault, despite what some had whispered. She tucked it carefully into her satchel. The morning mist provided cover as Sarah slipped from the house and made her way to the main road. The stagecoach to the railway station wouldn't arrive for another hour, but she preferred to wait in the cold rather than face her family's reaction to her empty room. 3 days later, Sarah stepped off the dusty stagecoach into the heart of Pine Ridge, Wyoming territory. The mountain town clung to the hillside like a collection of wooden boxes scattered by a giant's hand. Tall pines pressed close to the buildings, and the air carried the scent of sawdust and wood smoke. After the endless flatness of the plains, the towering peaks surrounding the valley felt both protective and intimidating. The main street was a mixture of mud and wooden planks, busy with miners heading to work and women hanging laundry despite the morning chill. Sarah clutched her carpet bag tighter and approached a woman sweeping the porch of what appeared to be a general store. "Excuse me, ma'am," Sarah said, her voice hoarse from the long journey. "I'm looking for work and a place to stay. Might you know of any opportunities?" The woman, middle-aged with kind eyes and graying hair pinned back severely, looked Sarah up and down with the practiced assessment of someone who'd seen many desperate souls arrive in Pine Ridge. "You running from something, honey, or running to something?" Sarah hesitated, then decided on honesty. A bit of both, I suppose. The woman's expression softened. I'm Martha Henderson. My husband and I run this store. She gestured to the building behind her. We've been needing help since our last girl got married and moved to Denver. You got any experience with bookkeeping and dealing with minors who think they're funnier than they are? Yes, ma'am. I helped run my family's farm accounts, and I've dealt with my share of difficult men. Sarah managed a small smile. I'm Sarah Williams. The false surname came easily. She was no longer Sarah Mitchell, the barren daughter sold for debt. Well, Sarah Williams, the job pays $20 a month plus room and board. You'd have the small apartment above the store. It's not much, but it's clean and warm. Martha's voice carried a note of warning. Pine Ridge isn't an easy place for a woman alone. We look after our own here, but there are rough elements. Mining towns attract all types. Sarah nodded gratefully. $20 is more than fair, Mrs. Henderson. I promise you won't regret giving me a chance. As Martha showed her the small but tidy apartment above the store, Sarah felt the first stirring of hope she'd experienced in months. The room had a window overlooking the main street, a small stove for cooking, and best of all, a door that locked from the inside. You start tomorrow morning, Martha said, but first let me introduce you around. People here are suspicious of strangers, but once they accept you, you'll have friends for life. That afternoon, Martha walked Sarah through the town, making introductions. There was Dr. Coleman, a tired-looking man who served as the town's only physician, and Pastor Morrison, whose small wooden church stood at the end of the main street. They met Mrs. Kowalski, who ran the boarding house and spoke with a thick Polish accent, and Tom Bradley, the blacksmith, whose forge sent sparks flying into the mountain air. It was at Bradley's forge that Sarah first saw Jacob Reeves. He stood with his back to them, carefully measuring a piece of wood against a partially constructed cabinet. Even from behind, Sarah could see the careful precision of his movements, the way he handled the tools with practiced expertise. When Tom called out to him, he turned, and Sarah found herself looking into the kindest brown eyes she'd ever seen. Jacob was tall and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting, and sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms, marked with small scars from his work. But it was his expression that caught her attention. There was a gentleness there that seemed at odds with the rough mountain town. "Jacob, come meet our new neighbor," Tom called out. "This is Sarah Williams. She'll be helping Martha at the store." Jacob wiped his hands on a cloth before approaching them, his movements careful and deliberate. "Ma'am," he said with a slight nod, his voice carrying a soft drawl that suggested origins further south. "Welcome to Pine Ridge." "Thank you," Sarah replied, surprised by the warmth in her own voice. "It seems like a good place to make a fresh start." Something in her words made Jacob's eyes sharpen slightly, as if he recognized the need for new beginnings. "It can be," he said quietly, "for those willing to work for it." As they continued their tour of the town, Martha filled Sarah in on Jacob's story. He came here about 2 years ago, was a soldier in the Indian Wars, but something happened. He won't talk about it. Started working as a carpenter and keeps mostly to himself. Good man, though, honest as the day is long. That evening, as Sarah arranged her few possessions in her new home, she found herself thinking about Jacob Reeves and the sadness she'd glimpsed behind his gentle manner. Perhaps Pine Ridge was a town of second chances, a place where people could reinvent themselves far from the judgments of their past. The sound of hammering from somewhere nearby suggested Jacob was working late into the evening. The rhythmic sound was oddly comforting, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this new place, that there were others here building something better from the pieces of their former lives. 2 weeks into her new life in Pine Ridge, Sarah had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The general store kept her busy from dawn until dusk, managing inventory, helping customers, and keeping the books for Martha and her husband Edgar. The work was honest and satisfying in a way her life on the farm had never been. The miners who frequented the store had initially been skeptical of the new woman, but Sarah's straightforward manner and refusal to be intimidated had won their grudging respect. She could calculate their purchases quickly, wasn't afraid to refuse credit to men who'd already spent their wages on whiskey, and had a sharp tongue for anyone who tried to take liberties. "You've got spine, girl," old Pete Callahan had told her after she'd firmly escorted a drunk miner out of the store. "Reminds me of my late wife. She could handle troublemakers twice her size with nothing but a look." It was on a particularly cold morning that Jacob Reeves appeared at the store's counter, his breath visible in the chilly air. Sarah looked up from the ledger she was updating, noting the way his dark hair was damp with melted snow. "Morning, Mr. Reeves," she said, setting down her pen. "What can I help you with today?" "I need some nails and wood stain," he replied, then hesitated. "And Martha mentioned you might have some of those new patent medicines. My shoulder's been giving me trouble with this weather change." Sarah studied his face, noting the way he held his left shoulder slightly higher than his right. "War injury?" she asked gently. Jacob's expression tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Something like that." She moved to the shelf where they kept the medical supplies, selecting a bottle of liniment. "My first husband dealt with pain from an old break that never healed right. This helped him on the worst days." She paused, then added quietly, "Sometimes the body holds on to hurt long after the mind tries to forget." Jacob looked at her with surprise, as if he hadn't expected such understanding. "Thank you," he said, his voice softer than usual. "I appreciate that." As Sarah gathered his other supplies, she found herself stealing glances at him. There was something compelling about his quiet strength, the way he seemed to listen more than he spoke. When she handed him his purchases, their fingers brushed briefly, and she felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest. "Mrs. Williams," Jacob said as he prepared to leave, then stopped himself. "Is it Mrs.? I don't want to presume." "It's Miss, actually," Sarah replied, the lie coming easier now. "I was married before, but, well, that's in the past now." Jacob nodded, understanding flickering in his eyes. "The past has a way of following us, but sometimes we can outrun it if we're determined enough." After he left, Sarah found herself thinking about his words. Was that what they were both doing here in Pine Ridge, outrunning their pasts? The thought was both comforting and unsettling. That afternoon, Martha noticed Sarah's distraction. "Jacob's a good man," she said without preamble, as they arranged new merchandise. "Quiet, but good. He's been alone too long, if you ask me." "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," Sarah replied, but she could feel heat rising in her cheeks. Martha chuckled. "Honey, I've been watching people for 50 years. I know attraction when I see it, and there's nothing wrong with it either. You're both young, both alone, both trying to build something new here." Sarah busied herself with folding fabric, unwilling to meet Martha's knowing gaze. The truth was, she had been thinking about Jacob more than was proper. There was something about his gentle manner that made her feel safe, in a way she hadn't experienced since before her first marriage. That evening, as Sarah was closing up the store, she heard the familiar sound of hammering from Jacob's workshop behind the blacksmith's forge. On impulse, she wrapped some leftover bread and soup from her dinner and made her way through the gathering dusk. Jacob's workshop was a lean-to addition to the back of Tom Bradley's building, lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Sarah could see him through the open doorway, bent over a delicate piece of carving work. The concentration on his face reminded her of a painter absorbed in his art. "Mr. Reeves," she called softly, not wanting to startle him. He looked up, setting down his tools. "Miss Williams, is everything all right?" "I brought you some supper," she said, suddenly feeling foolish. "I noticed you working late again and thought you might be hungry." Jacob's face softened with genuine surprise. "That's very kind of you. Please, come in." The workshop smelled of pine shavings and linseed oil. Sarah looked around at the various projects in different stages of completion: a child's rocking horse, a beautifully carved jewelry box, and what appeared to be parts of a dining table. "Your work is beautiful," she said, running her fingers along the smooth surface of the jewelry box. "You have real talent." "It helps quiet the mind," Jacob replied, accepting the bowl of soup gratefully. "When I'm working with my hands, creating something useful, it's the only time everything else goes quiet." Sarah understood exactly what he meant. "For me, it's numbers. When I'm working on the books, everything has to balance perfectly. There's something peaceful about making order from chaos." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both recognizing a kindred spirit in the other. Finally, Jacob spoke again. "Would you like to sit? I was just finishing up, but I'd welcome the company." Sarah accepted his offer, settling on a wooden crate while Jacob continued his carving. The intimacy of the moment, sharing a simple meal in the lamplight while wood shavings curled at their feet, felt more meaningful than any of the formal courtship rituals she'd experienced in her previous life. As October melted into November, the mountains around Pine Ridge began to show their winter coat. Snow dusted the peaks each morning, and the air carried the promise of harder weather to come. Sarah had never experienced a mountain winter, but the other residents assured her that Pine Ridge was well prepared for the isolation that would come with the heavy snows. Her evening visits to Jacob's workshop had become a regular occurrence, though neither of them had formally acknowledged what was developing between them. She would bring him dinner or coffee, and he would show her his latest projects while they talked about everything and nothing. These conversations revealed depths to both of them that surprised Sarah. Jacob, she learned, had grown up on a small farm in Texas before the war changed everything. He'd joined the cavalry young, drawn by promises of adventure and steady pay. The reality had been far different from the stories, and something during his service, something he still couldn't bring himself to discuss, had left him seeking peace in the remote mountains. "I used to think courage meant charging into battle without fear," he told her one evening, as he worked on a small wooden cross for Pastor Morrison. "Took me years to realize that real courage is getting up each day and choosing to build something better than what came before." Sarah found herself sharing more than she'd intended as well. She told him about the loneliness of her first marriage, the crushing weight of everyone's expectations, and the fear that had driven her to Pine Ridge. She was careful not to reveal the specific circumstances of her escape, but Jacob seemed to understand that she was running from more than just unhappy memories. "You know," he said one particularly cold evening, "I've been thinking about expanding this workshop, maybe building a proper furniture shop. There's enough demand in town, and the railroad's talking about extending the line up here, which would mean more people." "That sounds wonderful," Sarah replied, warming her hands around her coffee cup. "You could make beautiful pieces. I've seen how carefully you work." Jacob looked at her intently. "I was wondering if you might help me with the business side of things, the bookkeeping, dealing with customers. Martha says you have a head for numbers." The suggestion made Sarah's heart race. Working together would mean spending even more time with Jacob, building something together. But it also felt dangerous. The more involved she became in Pine Ridge, the harder it would be to disappear if her past caught up with her. "I'd like that," she heard herself saying before her fears could stop her. "I'd like that very much." Jacob's smile was worth the risk. Their collaboration began immediately. Jacob showed Sarah his rough sketches for expanding the workshop, and she helped him calculate costs and potential profits. Working side by side, their relationship shifted from friendship into something deeper, though both were careful not to push too fast. It was during one of these planning sessions that Jacob finally shared the story that had brought him to Pine Ridge. They were reviewing lumber costs when Sarah noticed him rubbing his left shoulder, the old injury clearly bothering him. "It was at Sand Creek," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the wind outside. "I was young, followed orders without question, believed what they told us about protecting settlers." He stopped carving, his hands still on the wood. "What we did there, it wasn't war, Sarah. It was slaughter. Women, children, old people who'd come in peace under a flag of truce." Sarah felt her breath catch. She'd heard whispers about Sand Creek, the massacre that had horrified even those accustomed to frontier violence. "I tried to stop it," Jacob continued, his voice raw with old pain. "Got this shoulder injury when an officer knocked me down for refusing to fire on children. Afterward, I couldn't be that person anymore. Couldn't be a soldier for a cause that would do such things." He looked at her then, his eyes full of the fear that she would judge him, reject him for the things he'd witnessed and the guilt he carried. Instead, Sarah reached out and covered his hands with her own. "You tried to stop it," she said firmly. "That's what matters. You chose to be better than the situation demanded." The relief in Jacob's face was almost painful to witness. "I was afraid you'd think less of me if you knew." "Jacob Reeves," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the emotion welling up in her chest. "You are the finest man I've ever known. Your past doesn't define you, your choices do, and every day I've known you, you've chosen kindness, honesty, and gentleness." That night, as Jacob walked her back to the store in the softly falling snow, their relationship crossed an invisible threshold. When they reached her door, he turned to face her, his expression serious. "Sarah," he said softly, "I want you to know that whatever brought you to Pine Ridge, whatever you're running from, it doesn't matter to me. What matters is who you are now, who you choose to be." Standing there in the snow, looking up into his honest brown eyes, Sarah felt something she'd never experienced before, the possibility of being truly loved for exactly who she was. When Jacob leaned down to kiss her gently, she didn't pull away. Instead, she let herself believe, for the first time in her life, that she might deserve this kind of happiness. Winter settled over Pine Ridge like a heavy blanket, transforming the mountain town into an isolated world of snow and firelight. The railroad had suspended service until spring, and the mining operations slowed to a crawl as the bitter cold made outdoor work nearly impossible. For Sarah, the enforced isolation felt like a blessing rather than a burden. It meant her past was truly buried under the winter snow, at least for now. Her relationship with Jacob had deepened through the long winter evenings. They spent most nights together in his workshop, her helping with designs and measurements, while he crafted furniture that would be sold come spring. Their conversations had grown more intimate, and Sarah found herself sharing pieces of her heart she'd never revealed to anyone. "Tell me about your dreams," Jacob said one February evening as they sat close together for warmth, the workshop's small stove barely keeping the mountain cold at bay. Sarah considered the question seriously. "I used to dream about being needed," she said finally. "Really needed. Not just as a pair of hands to work or a womb to carry children. I wanted to matter to someone." Jacob's arm tightened around her shoulders. "You matter to me," he said simply. "More than I ever thought possible." The honesty in his voice made Sarah's chest tight with emotion. She turned to face him, studying the strong lines of his face in the lamplight. "Jacob, there are things about my past—" "I don't care," he interrupted gently. "Whatever happened before you came here doesn't change how I feel about you." That night, for the first time since arriving in Pine Ridge, Sarah allowed herself to believe she might have found a place where she truly belonged. When Jacob kissed her, she responded with all the longing and hope she'd kept buried for so long. 3 weeks later, Sarah woke feeling queasy for the third morning in a row. At first she attributed it to something she'd eaten, but when the nausea persisted and she realized she'd missed her monthly cycle, the truth hit her like a physical blow. She was pregnant. Sarah sat on the edge of her narrow bed, her hands trembling as she pressed them against her still flat stomach. After years of being told she was barren, after the shame and disappointment of her childless first marriage, the possibility had never occurred to her. The irony was almost cruel. She'd finally found love and acceptance, only to face the same situation that had destroyed her first chance at happiness. What if Jacob reacted like William had? What if this pregnancy became another source of anxiety and expectation that would poison their relationship? But even as fear threatened to overwhelm her, Sarah felt something else stirring in her chest, a fierce, protective love for the tiny life growing inside her. This child would be born from love, not duty. This child would be wanted, cherished, regardless of what anyone else thought. For 3 days, Sarah wrestled with how to tell Jacob. She watched him work, noting the gentle way he handled delicate carvings, the patience he showed when teaching her new techniques. Finally, on a snowy Thursday evening, she gathered her courage. "Jacob," she said as they sat in his workshop, her voice steadier than she felt, "I need to tell you something important." He looked up from the chair leg he was sanding, immediately alert to the seriousness in her tone. Setting down his tools, he gave her his full attention. "I'm pregnant," Sarah said simply, then held her breath as she waited for his reaction. Jacob's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and then something that looked like wonder. "Pregnant?" he repeated, as if testing the word. "I know it's unexpected," Sarah rushed on, her words tumbling over each other. "I was told I couldn't have children. My first husband and I tried for 3 years with no success. Everyone said I was barren, and I believed them. But somehow—" Jacob stood and crossed to her, kneeling beside her chair and taking her hands in his. "Sarah," he said, his voice filled with awe, "are you telling me we're going to have a baby?" The wonder in his voice, the joy beginning to bloom in his eyes, made Sarah's throat tight with emotion. "Yes," she whispered. "We're going to have a baby." Jacob's smile was radiant. He stood and gently pulled Sarah to her feet, his hands coming to rest on her waist. "I can't believe it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "A baby. Our baby." "You're not upset?" Sarah asked, still hardly daring to believe his reaction. "Upset?" Jacob laughed, the sound rich and warm in the small workshop. "Sarah, I've dreamed of having a family of my own since I was a boy. I thought after everything that happened after the war, I thought I didn't deserve that kind of happiness." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumb brushing away a tear she didn't realize had fallen. "You've given me everything I never dared hope for. Love, purpose, and now this incredible gift." That night, as they planned for their future, Sarah felt a completeness she'd never experienced. They talked about expanding the workshop into a proper home, about the crib Jacob would build, about teaching their child to read and work with their hands. "We'll need to be married," Jacob said practically. "I want to do this right, Sarah. I want our child to have my name and know they were born from love." Sarah's heart swelled at his words. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." A week later, Pastor Morrison performed a simple ceremony in his small church with Martha and Edgar Henderson as witnesses. Sarah wore her best dress, altered to accommodate her changing figure, and Jacob had carved her a simple wooden ring since the general store didn't carry jewelry. As they exchanged vows, Sarah felt the weight of her past finally lifting. She was no longer the unwanted daughter sold to pay debts, no longer the barren wife who'd failed to fulfill her purpose. She was Sarah Reeves now, beloved wife and mother-to-be, building a life of her own choosing. That evening, as they celebrated quietly in their workshop-turned-home, Sarah placed Jacob's hand on her stomach, where the first gentle swelling was becoming apparent. "I love you," she told him, the words carrying all the gratitude and wonder of her transformation. "I love you too," Jacob replied, his voice soft with reverence. "Both of you." Outside, the mountain wind howled through the pines, but inside their small sanctuary, surrounded by the evidence of Jacob's skilled hands and their shared dreams, Sarah had never felt safer or more cherished. She had found her worth not in others' expectations, but in the love she'd chosen to accept and the family she was helping to create. As spring approached and the snow began to melt, revealing the green promise of new life beneath, Sarah Reeves looked toward the future with hope instead of fear. Her child would be born free from the judgments that had once defined her, raised in a home built on love, respect, and the quiet strength that came from choosing to build something beautiful from the broken pieces of the past. The story of the woman who'd been sold as barren had become the story of a mother who'd found her true worth in the mountains of Wyoming, proof that sometimes the most unexpected paths lead to the most precious destinations.